Tim Hague got his master's in divinity back in 1976. Been around a while, a little bit older than me. He's actually been kind of messianic in the Messianic Jewish movement since about 1990, so one of the earlier ones involved in this. He's written about 40 different books on biblical commentaries and supporting Torah observance. Again, it was actually his son Caleb was the one that was running that seminar that we went to, and I think this is one of the 2 or 3 books that I ordered from that group as part of that, just kind of following up. Part of that seminar was they were bringing together kind of respected scholars who supported Torah observance for, I guess, people or Gentiles, especially Christians. I say respected because most of the guys had advanced seminary degrees, but they participate more in the mainstream academia within Christianity. What they're trying to do is inject a little bit more scholarship into this Messianic Jewish movement within those established circles. I think there's a need to do that because the Messianic Jewish movement has kind of been substantially among the laity. If you think about it, you don't really have a lot of known biblical scholars that are promoting this, or at least converted to this. And so I think the kind of the Messianic Jewish movement has kind of been from the ground up, it looks like to me. And part of the reason I think that the Messianic Jewish movement is sprung out more from the laity is that you can't really be in those Christian academic circles and promote this ideology. You'll be asked to leave pretty quickly. And if you're a scholar in this, getting a university or somehow getting your livelihood, in such a manner, that's a really daunting thing to say. I'm going to do this knowing I'm going to be asked to leave. I'm going to find another line of work to make my money. And so I think that's part of why so few have done that. The subject of this book is basically to defend what's called one law theology against those who think that the Jews should keep the Sabbath while basically Gentiles should not. And these are people coming from the Messianic Jewish movement that are saying this. The subject of the book is basically to defend the one law theology. That might seem like kind of a thing that the Jews versus Christian doctrine that you'd hear from Christian community. But like I said, no, it's coming from Messianic Jews. Messianic Jews are saying that the Jewish people are required to keep the Torah, such as the Sabbaths and the feasts and the kosher and all that. Whereas they call Messianic Gentiles within their own synagogues, they not only are not required to, let's say, whatever you mean by required, and kind of almost get the impression that they prefer that they not. They've written a bunch of papers in these circles defending the practice and providing evidence that they call the errant one law. So there's a group out there that calls one law an error of doctrine. And of course, he's now writing this book to defend it. But there's a group out there, the Messianic Jews, that kind of poo-poo the one law and write these papers against such a thing. But it's true that there are different rules for different groups of people, even within Israel. For example, only the Levites could serve in the temple. Actually, I said to somebody last week or two that Levites had to marry Levites, but that's not true. I forget who I told that to, but that was a mistake. There is one restriction that I think I know of is that the Kohanim, the high priest, he's not allowed to marry a divorced woman or a widow or someone she has to be a virgin. But it doesn't even have to be from somebody from Levi either. That was the one restriction that I found. I don't know where I had that idea in my head that Levites had to marry only Levites. Not true. But they still have different rules for different things. Again, there's a subset of those Levites who are descendants of Aaron and Cohen that could be the priests. The rest of the Levites served as general attendants, gatekeepers, and musicians and such. The priests have different rules. If you're a high priest, you're not allowed to touch the dead. You cannot marry, again, a high priest cannot marry a divorced or a widowed woman. And of course, there's certainly differences in the Torah between men and women. And so there are different laws for different groups of people in that respect. So it's not a huge stretch to suppose that there's different laws between Jews and Gentiles. It's only a stretch because the Bible clearly never says that. And indeed, it clearly says the opposite. which is this, again, basically the opposite. The one law is the doctrine that Tim Hegg is presenting in this book. And I believe Tim Hegg was fairly connected at one point with a group called First Fruits of Zion. First Fruits of Zion, or FFZ, whatever.org. It's a web page that's out there, got a lot of good information on their web page. And it made sense because, I'm going to say FFOZ. FFOZ wrote books promoting one law theology at one point. They did. At one point, FFOZ would agree with all of the stuff that Tim Hegg wrote here. But they changed their doctrine in about 2010 and now write things that include the two laws, and they write against it. And so they've changed their doctrine. They use verses like Acts 15:1 to say that Gentiles are not required to become Jewish to join a Messianic Jewish movement. They're calling this, apparently the new thing that they're giving is they're calling it distinction theology. But they seem to confuse Jewish identity as a racial group from Gentiles from the clear indication that Acts 15:1 was about to be saved. It's not about being identity, it's about whether you're saved or not. And every paper that I've read from that crowd doesn't seem to make that distinction. Even Tim Hegg in this book kind of concedes that Acts 15 is about becoming Jewish as opposed to becoming saved, which is, that's a pretty important distinction. It says right there in 15:1, they were requiring them to do these things in order to be saved. And so he kind of concedes that even in this book, which I disagree with. But he tries to make an argument for the one law even with that concession. It seems to bother these Messianic Jews that they can't look across a room or a synagogue and immediately determine who is Jewish genetically and who is not. And as if this superficial observation alone causes genetic Jews to forget they're genetically Jewish and therefore have lost their identity. Therefore, Messianic Gentiles have superseded Jews as far as they're concerned, and so they call this supersessionism, which is a word that supersessionism actually is a word that Microsoft Spell doesn't even recognize. They recognize supersession, not supersessionism. So they're creating a word that Microsoft doesn't even recognize in the spell check. They call this also replacement theology, which is a horrible misapplication, in my opinion, of that term, because that certainly is much more like the two-house junk, or even basic Christianity. It says the church has replaced Israel. That's really what that replacement theology is for. And they're trying to apply that, though, here to Messianic Gentiles that were to lead, basically. Now, as stated from, I think I have this on the slide here. As stated from this man named Thomas Lancaster, this is a paper that he wrote very recently, August 20th, 2025. Replacement theology and one law theology are two sides of the same coin. Really? I disagree with that. No, they're not. Replacement theology teaches that Gentile Christians' identity replaces Jewish identity. One law theology teaches that Jewish identity replaces Gentile Christian identity. I just disagree with that. No, it doesn't. But he just states that it does. I disagree. It does not. But that is basically the crux of the angst amongst the two, I'm going to call them the two-law group, which should sound bizarre, but that's basically what they're arguing for. There's a two-law group. They don't call themselves that. I'm calling them that, right? And it's not really based on Scripture, but it's based on this emotion of identity. And they use that emotion to cloud how they interpret Scripture. They use this emotion to try to explain away clear biblical statements like being grafted in. The Gentiles are grafted in. They're adopted as sons, become one new man, Jew and Gentile. Mixed multitude that came out of Israel. You've been brought near to the promises of Israel. And actually, that's one that he doesn't even address in here. But I think that's a powerful one too. You Gentiles who were once far from the covenants of Israel have been brought near. It seems this identity crisis never existed in the Bible. Because I'm guessing why, I don't know. Probably because there were 10 times as many Jews as Gentiles in the synagogues at the time that Scripture was written. Maybe that has something to do with it. But right now, in Messianic Jewish synagogue circles, it's the opposite. There's like 10 times as many Gentiles who've come into this walk as actual Jews who've converted. And so maybe that's part of the ratio. So it seems like it's more of a numbers issue that bothers them more than a theology. But they try to build a theology around this. And they've even invented, I used to think it was more in Scripture, but I looked at it, it's not. They've kind of invented what they call the 7 Noahide laws. They're never really, Noahide laws don't really exist in Scripture. There's really only 2 that were given to Noah when he left the ark. But they actually get the 7 total coming from really Talmud. And of course, Talmud was written centuries after Yeshua by Jews who rejected Messiah, Yeshua as Messiah. First Fruits of Zion then adds 4 more laws to this Noahide law. These are the requirements from Acts 15:20. So they've taken the 7 Noahide laws, 5 of which are really not in Scripture for Noah, come from the Talmud. Then they'll throw 4 more from Acts 15:20 and say that's it. And then they'll throw in Leviticus 19:18. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. So this is a real messy doctrine, in my opinion. That's basically, now we've got 12 laws, and Lancaster says most of the Torah's 613 commandments are actually still applicable to Gentiles. What? But then he writes this. This is, I think I have this slide too. Right? The exceptions. The exceptions, and I put this in parentheses, the exceptions of Gentiles following the 613, the parentheses is mine, just to help you understand where I'm pulling this out of his paper. The exceptions of the Gentiles following the 613 are commandments pertaining to Israelite sanctities. I think I highlighted sanctities, right? No, I didn't. Pay attention to that word. He's calling this word sanctities. It's Israel's sanctities, such as calendar observations, Sabbath and the festival, circumcision, tzitzit, tephilim, mezuzah, and the rest of the dietary laws. Commandments pertaining to Israel's sanctity, which are those I just listed, are not considered incumbent upon the Gentile disciples. I know, I don't know how they support this. This is clearly saying that there are 2 laws, one for Gentiles and the other for the Jews. And Gentiles don't have to follow the Torah, basically. And that's basically what Christianity says, right? Christianity says, don't follow that Sabbath, don't follow kosher. Now you've got, unfortunately, I think a broad swath of the Messianic Jewish community is saying the same thing. They've bizarrely come full circle, if you ask me, on that. And so many Messianic groups, Jewish groups such as First Fruits of Zion, have grown away from their first fruits to be more universally adopt this 2-law doctrine, especially in the last 20 years or so, which is about the time frame that some of us have kind of been doing this thing. And so, when I first started, this wasn't as vocal or as obvious, or I don't know what, there wasn't as much written about this. And it's kind of been a thing that's been developing since I came into this walk. We've been talking about our identity, but it seems the Jews involved in this movement are also freaking out about their identity. I'm not sure what this means for our identity, but I don't have any immediate plans to change our basic halakha. And I admit that this was not a drash, but a bit of a book report, so I apologize if that was... But that's what Elohim led me to spend time on. So, and again, it doesn't necessarily fit into the Parsha. And I don't know what that means for us. Like I said, I'm just telling you, this is where I am. Some of you may not be aware of some of this stuff, but it's kind of out there. And it may have ultimately, decide where we decide our identity is. Because if Messianic Judaism goes this way, maybe we don't want to say we're connected with it, but we'll kind of keep an eye on that. Getting back to the Parsha a little bit, this is Vayihi, and he lived. And much like the Parsha, which is the life of Sarah, the drash is about the death of Sarah. This drash is titled And He Lived, but it's really about the death of Jacob or Israel. It's also about the death of Joseph, if you read to the end of it. And in the Haftarah, they talk about the death of David. And we read that portion, which I thought was a little shocking, is that David's dying breath is to say, go kill this guy with a sword. Oh, right. Like, what? That's your dying prayer? Right. He was a bad guy. I'm not saying he was wrong, right? I'm not going to accuse David of doing something wrong there. He has his faults, right? He's here with Bathsheba. He certainly has his faults. I don't know if this was a wrong one, though. But yeah, that's kind of shocking. You think that most people wouldn't say, go kill this guy with a sword, and then as your dying breath. A big part of what Jacob does near the end of his life is pronounce the blessings on his children. And that's a big part of what's in this portion. We also see the death of Joseph at the end of our parsha, which is actually the end of the book of Genesis. We should have done the Hazak thing, by the way. Hazak, Hazak, Renee, Hazak. Thank you. The last verse of the book of Genesis is Joseph being placed into a coffin in Egypt, which made me switch to some archaeology. So at least this one is a tangent, but it's based on that point right there. The very end of Genesis says Joseph is placed in a coffin of some sort, sarcophagus, right there in Egypt where he was. And so I've done this before, but I did a little bit more research on this. I might have presented this the last year or two. Maybe some of you remember this. But I've got this next photo, which is this top of a statue. Now, this is called the Avaris statue, or part of it anyway. The name of that is because it was located in an area called Avaris. The name of Avaris was an ancient Egypt name. They don't use that name today. That name comes from a papyrus dating to 13th century BC, which is just shocking to me that basically a piece of paper has survived over 1,000 years BC to today. It seems like one rain or a little bit of fire, or just, I don't know. It's amazing that I don't know how it survived, but there's a papyrus that dates that calls this area Avaris. Today the site's called Tel El Daba, but this is similar, or name location in the Bible, as Goshen, right? So we know that the Egypt settled in Goshen, which is basically the lower part of Egypt, right? If you got the Nile River runs from south to north, right, into the Mediterranean. And as it kind of gets towards the Mediterranean, it kind of fans out, right? You got this delta, and there's a lot of green areas there. And it's kind of in that delta somewhere that is the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were said to have settled. This is only the remains of, I guess, part of the head of this statue. The excavations at this site started in 1941, but this particular statue wasn't discovered in this excavation or uncovered until 1986, which is an incredibly late date as far as Egyptian things go, to find something as substantial as this, in my opinion. But they date the statue, because it was found in some layers, that they date to about 1700 BC. This makes it relatively old, even compared to many Egyptian discoveries, although some Egyptian discoveries go back to about 3000 BC, as they say, they would tell you. Although that might be pre-flood, but okay, we don't want to get there. It was believed to be in a city that was intentionally destroyed by the Egyptians at about 550 BC. The city was destroyed. That's a long time ago. And it was destroyed by the Egyptians. The people of that time were actually given a name called Hyksos. This is universally believed to not be a depiction of an Egyptian man. This is not a depiction of an Egyptian man. This is a Semitic man. The mushroom hair is never seen as a depiction of Egyptians. This points to what they say is a Canaanite origin of this figure. The face appears to have been deliberately destroyed even in ancient times. Now, there's another photo I have, the next one, of a shoulder piece. This colorful striped garment is also something that's not used to depict Egyptian rulers. And so this is clearly not an Egyptian character that's part of this statue. The next photo I have is kind of a drawing that kind of shows the full statue. It's approximately 1.5 times actual size, so maybe about 9 feet tall. So it's a pretty good sized thing. Larger than an actual person, but not like a colossus like the Sphinx. You can see the throw stick, this little throw stick he's handing in his right arm is going over his right shoulder. The throw stick is a symbol of a ruler in Egyptian depictions. And so, to summarize, this is a statue of a Semitic ruler in the land of Goshen dating to about 1700 BC, and it was found in an empty tomb. The word Avaris doesn't mean anything in Egyptian. It's not actually an Egyptian root word. It's a foreign word, and people have speculated as what that could have come from. One speculation is that Hebrew is actually pronounced Ivri in Hebrew. Ish is man, so Ivri-ish means Hebrew man. They're thinking that may have devolved into Avaris. That might be a stretch in my opinion. Interesting, neither wiki page. So there's wiki pages for Avaris, and there's a wiki page for Tel El Daba. Two different wiki pages basically addressing this same thing. They don't show any photos of this statue. They don't even mention that such a thing exists at either of these sites whatsoever. If you read those pages and only those pages, you would have no idea that this thing exists. I think that's interesting. Also, I'm not sure why we don't have better photos of it, because photography certainly existed in the 1980s. Unfortunately, the current location of this statue is unknown. When questioned by one archaeologist, the Egyptian authorities, they say the statue has been misplaced. Given the size and the weight of this thing, it seems to strain credibility that it was just accidentally lost and can't be found somewhere in the bowels of the Cairo Museum. It seems suspicious, like the current Egyptian Muslim authorities are also concerned this may actually be a statue of the Jewish Joseph, and they are trying to hide it to prevent confirmation of that. One somewhat skeptical scholar had this to say about the now lost statue. This guy's name is Scotty Roberts. I think it's my next slide. Now, Scotty Roberts says David Rohl took great liberties in producing his own private chronology of the Egyptian kings, mostly to bolster his personal theories on the historical Moses. Most biblical archaeologists and Egyptologists scoff at his chronology. So here's a guy that's very skeptical, let's say, of some of this work, that is skeptical of Moses or any chronology associated with that. However, he says, he is correct about the statue of Joseph, which is not his own personal theory. The probability that this is the actual statue of the biblical Joseph is remarkably high. He quotes mentions this Charles Ayling was one of his professors years ago, and presently the chair of history at the University of Northwestern and president of the Near Middle East Archaeological Society. Ayling told me personally that he thinks the statue, as well as the palace, is very probably that of the biblical Joseph. Now, Ayling is part of a biblicalarchaeology.org website, and so he may have his own bias in that regard, but still, it's interesting and it's compelling for those. The next slide, I think, is just nothing, right? Okay. So, done with archaeology. I did a book report and I did my archaeology. But at least the archaeology was about Joseph and his tomb, I think, which does fit back to the Parsha. Like I said, the Parsha is a lot about the deaths of these men, what they decided to say kind of as their last words. Maybe get some thought into what they were thinking. And this drosh is, I guess, about their lives, but again, it's also more about their deaths. And it's true that a death makes you think more about your life. We get busy fighting through our daily lives most days, and we don't think about our actual lives. Our lives are eternal, and we don't think about that very much, right? We kind of have a very compressed view, I guess, of what our life is and where it's going. Sometimes we don't even think about the long-term implications of things. But if you think about it as we believe, our life is eternal. And everything that we do today has eternal consequences. And that changes your perspective on thinking about your life and your death and what's really important. And that's about all I got. That's the end of my drosh. So.